The empty hoard. The cave had once smelled like smoke and warm stone and mother. Now it smelled like dust. Not the rich mineral dust of deep earth that dragons cultivated over centuries, the kind that settled into scales like a second skin and carried the memory of everything that had ever rested in it. This was the thin, indifferent dust of absence of air that moved through a space without purpose, stirring nothing, carrying nothing, depositing its pale residue over objects that had once been touched with care and were now simply waiting to be forgotten. Ember sat in the middle of what remained of his hoard and tried very hard not to think about the word remained. The collection arranged before him on the cave floor was a modest thing by any measure, and by dragon measures it was nearly heartbreaking. A wooden horse with a chipped ear, carved from pale birchwood by hands that understood the particular way a horse holds its weight in stillness. A glass marble deep blue at its center that caught even the faintest light and threw its small rainbows against the cave wall with a generosity entirely disproportionate to its size, little offerings of color in the gray. A stuffed cloth bird his mother had traded from a traveling merchant when Ember was still small enough to sleep curled inside the warm hollow of her wing, when the world had been defined entirely by the sound of her breathing and the heat that rolled off her scales like a banked hearth. He was still small. That was the problem, really. That was the center of it, the hard seat around which everything else had accumulated. He was barely 3 seasons old, which in dragon years was barely anything at all, a breath, a suggestion, a creature still in the process of deciding what it would eventually become. His scales were the soft, uncertain green of new leaves pushing through soil in early spring, the color of things that have not yet had to be anything in particular. They would deepen someday, his mother had told him, pressing her great snout against the top of his head in that particular way she had that meant she was breathing in his scent. They would become emerald or perhaps something darker, forest deep and faceted like a cut stone, the kind of green that suggested old growth and patience and the capacity to endure. Someday, she had said. Her voice had the low resonance of a bell made from something older than bronze. He had to survive long enough for someday to arrive. His fire came in weak little puffs, more the memory of fire than fire itself, small clouds of warmth that dissipated almost immediately and were good for very little beyond, demonstrating that the capacity existed somewhere inside him, coiled and waiting to grow. He could not heat a stone with it, not reliably. He could not cook the rabbits he occasionally managed to corner in the gorse below the mountain, moving with a slowness that embarrassed him, using patience instead of speed because his legs were short and his wings, though they existed, though they caught the air and sometimes gave him a lurching, undignified sort of lift, could not carry him far or fast. His claws were sharp enough that he could say with some pride. But they belonged to a creature that weighed less than a grown man, less than the hunting dogs he had watched from a distance in the valley, and sharpness without weight behind it is a more limited asset than the stories suggest. He was a small thing in a large world, and the world had recently made that very clear. His parents had not abandoned him. This was the one truth he returned to with regularity, turning it over in his mind the way his tongue returned to a sore tooth, not because it made the pain less, but because confirming the shape of it somehow kept the shape from growing. They had not chosen to leave him. He needed that to be true and believed, in some deep place beneath the hunger and the cold and the echoing silence of the cave, that it was. His mother had placed him behind the boulder herself that night, had tucked the cloth bird in beside him without explanation, had rested her head against the cave floor level with his own, and looked at him for a long moment with those great amber eyes that contained more gold than the treasure she kept. She had not said hide or be still or do not come out no matter what you hear. She had not needed to. She had simply looked at him, and he had understood, and he had felt, somewhere in the same place he now felt the hollow ache of their absence, that she had known something was coming that she could not stop and could not explain. The nights had come like weather. He had heard it through the boulder, the sound of hooves on stone, then the scrape of metal, then voices he could not make out clearly over the sound of his own heartbeat, then sounds he did not want to give names to, then silence. He had waited 3 weeks. He had eaten the dried fruit and the small cache of smoked meat his mother had kept in a clay jar near the back wall, parceling it out with a discipline that did not come naturally to a creature his age, making each day's portion exactly equal because equality felt like the only kind of control available to him. He had told himself each morning that today might be the day, that dragons were difficult to kill, that his father was old and clever and had survived things that would have ended lesser creatures, that his mother was fiercer than the mountain itself and would find a way. They had not come back. So Ember did what any creature on the edge of starvation eventually does, which is to abandon the luxury of waiting and make some accounting of what it actually has. He looked at the hoard. He looked at the cave entrance where the gray light of morning was beginning to feel less like promise and more like accusation. He looked at himself, small and green-scaled and underfed, his ribs pressing a little too insistently against his sides, and he calculated the distance between what he was and what he needed, and found it significant, and decided that it would have to be crossed anyway. He tucked the wooden horse under his arm. It was the most obviously beautiful thing he owned, the craftsmanship clear even to someone who knew nothing about wood or carving, the particular way the maker had suggested muscle under the smooth surface, the way the mane had been rendered not in careful lines but in a single flowing motion, as if the sculptor had simply released the horse that was already inside the wood. He had always suspected it was worth something to people who cared about such things. He walked down the mountain in the early morning cold, his breath making small clouds that were more visible than his fire and rather less useful, and he tried to think only about the mechanics of walking. One foot and then the next. The path was steep and his legs were short, and he slipped twice on the icy patches where the north-facing rock never saw enough sun. Both times he caught himself without dropping the horse, which felt like a small victory he wasn't sure he deserved. He smelled the market before he saw it. Wood smoke, animal heat, bread baking somewhere behind a closed door, the sharp mineral tang of fresh-cut vegetables laid out on cloth. It reached him before the sounds did, before the voices and the commerce and the particular noise of people going about the business of living, which he had not heard in 3 weeks and which struck him unexpectedly like something with physical weight. He had known there would be starring. He had not been fully prepared for the texture of it. The screaming was actually easier than the silence. The woman who fainted did so quickly and was attended to quickly, and the brief chaos of that cleared a small radius around him which he found, honestly, preferable to the press of bodies. The people who screamed at least acknowledged him as a thing worth responding to. It was the silence afterward, the wide-eyed, frozen kind, that he found hardest to navigate. Being stared at by 30 people who have collectively decided not to move is a specific experience that requires a specific kind of steadiness he was not certain he possessed. But the gnome had come. Fossick was small even by gnome standards, with the particular quality of someone who has spent a long time looking carefully at things and making accurate assessments of their value. He had a gray beard that seemed to hold opinions and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging. He had walked up to Ember without ceremony, studied the wooden horse with the practiced disinterest of someone who had been negotiating price since before Ember's parents were hatched, turned it over twice, examined the chipped ear, and offered 3 copper coins in a tone that suggested this was approximately half what he believed it was worth, but that he would begin there. Ember had taken it without negotiation, because he did not yet know how to negotiate, and because 3 copper coins felt in that moment like solid ground under his feet. He came to understand the market as a place with its own particular rules, its own small geographies and customs. He found the patch of ground near the well, slightly out of the main flow of foot traffic, enough space to lay his cloth square flat without it being stepped on, close enough to the well that people stopped nearby regularly and might glance over. He learned which merchants would approach him with something approaching normalcy, and which would go conspicuously out of their way to avoid his section of the square. He learned to arrive early, when the light was soft and the crowd was thin and the territory of his small patch was easier to maintain. He laid each object out with care that probably looked excessive to outside eyes. There was a particular logic to the arrangement. The way the bronze mirror caught the morning light and threw it in a way that drew the eye, the way the painted river stones his mother had collected were positioned so their colors complemented rather than competed, the way he placed each piece as if the arrangement itself was also something worth looking at. He had watched his mother do this, he realized. Had watched her handle the objects in her hoard with a deliberateness that he had absorbed without knowing he was absorbing it. Fossick came most often, sometimes other merchants, sometimes villagers who had gotten over the starring quickly enough to become curious, which was almost always how it went: first fear, then starring, then the irresistible pull of curiosity, which Ember had come to understand was simply fear that has decided it would rather know than not know. He accepted whatever was offered because whatever was offered was better than nothing, and he had become very clear-eyed about what the alternative looked like. The adults pretended he wasn't there. This was worse than the fear. It was something he had not anticipated and found difficult to build a protection against. When someone was afraid of him, at least the fear was a kind of acknowledgement, a statement that he existed, that he registered, that his presence warranted a response. The deliberate unseeing of the adults who walked past with their eyes slightly too far to the left of him, who arranged their voices and their attention so carefully around the fact of him that the avoidance itself became visible. This was a different thing. This was being present and being told through the precision of the avoidance that presence was not enough. The children were better in their way. They stared openly and whispered loudly and occasionally crept closer in the way children do, drawn by the particular magnetism of things that adults have decided not to look at. He had learned not to make sudden movements around the younger ones and to meet the eyes of the older ones calmly, which usually resulted in the specific kind of delighted terror that comes from an encounter with something outside the known world going better than expected. He sold the bronze mirror and the river stones and the 3 carved wooden boxes his mother had used to store small things whose names he didn't know. He sold a small oil lamp with a green glass shade that had always thrown light the color of young leaves. He sold a length of silk cord, faded red, that had been wrapped around something he couldn't remember. Each time something left the cloth square and coins arrived in its place, and he carried the coins back up the mountain and parceled them out against the cost of bread and dried meat. And occasionally, when there was enough, the dense winter apples that kept well and could be traded from the fruit seller 2 stalls over from Fossick's spot. He bought the wooden horse back twice. The first time he told himself it was because Fossick had undervalued it and he was simply correcting a market error, that it would sell for more to someone else, that holding it a little longer was a reasonable economic decision. He had even believed this for a few days, sitting with the horse on the cave floor, turning it in the firelight from the small wood fire he had bought fuel for, watching the shadows move in the carved grooves of the mane. The second time, he did not tell himself anything. He simply handed over the coins and walked home and set it on the cloth bird's left side and sat for a long time looking at both of them. Winter was not coming anymore. Winter had arrived. It was in the mountain at night now, in the breath of cold that moved through the cave entrance despite the hanging he had put up, salvaged oilcloth traded for a set of copper rings, and settled in the corners and along the floor where the stone absorbed the cold and held it. He had learned to sleep pressed against the cave wall farthest from the entrance, which retained a little of the day's thin warmth, with everything he owned piled around him in a way that had nothing to do with hoarding and everything to do with insulation. The wood was the problem, he needed it. His fire was improving, he had been practicing, focusing on the mechanics of it with the grim patience of someone who understands that skill is survival, but it was not yet reliable enough to be his primary source of heat, and reliable was the operative word in a mountain winter. He had priced wood 3 times in the last 2 weeks, running the numbers against his remaining coins, watching them not quite reach. The wooden horse was the gap. He understood this with a clarity that did not require contemplation. He understood it completely and then sat with the understanding for several days, turning it over, examining it from different angles, looking for a version of the calculation that came out differently. It did not. He needed the wood. The horse would cover the wood. The alternative was cold of a kind that didn't care about sentiment. He sat with the horse for a long time on the morning he brought it down. He turned it the way Fossick had turned it, over twice, the chipped ear passing under his thumb, the smooth curve of the flank, the mane that moved even in stillness. He thought about his mother's hands, her great clawed hands, careful as anything, setting it into the hoard with the specific care reserved for things that would be kept a long time. He thought about what it meant to keep something. He thought about what it meant when the keeping was no longer possible. He wrapped it in the corner of the cloth before he picked the cloth up, so that it wouldn't be the first thing he was holding when he arrived. He didn't examine his reasons for this. The market was at its mid-morning fullness when he arrived, the wellside patch already slightly trampled from the earlier foot traffic. He laid out the cloth with the usual care, arranged the remaining objects fewer, now the cloth square looking noticeably less full than it had in the early weeks, and placed the wooden horse at the center because it deserved the center, and sat back on his haunches and looked at the arrangement and waited. The cold came up through the stone under his feet. Somewhere behind him a cart wheel needed grease and was announcing this loudly and at regular intervals. Fossick was engaged with another customer 3 stalls over, gesturing with both hands in a way that suggested the negotiation was at an interesting point. The sky above the market square was the flat white of a winter day that has not yet decided what it intends. He had not planned to cry. The concept had not occurred to him as a possibility, which perhaps explained why it arrived without warning, rising from somewhere below planning and intention. It was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet, which somehow made it harder to stop, just his eyes going wrong and the air tasting like cold salt and the wooden horse blurring slightly in his vision, its careful lines softening. He was thinking about the marble. He had sold it weeks ago and mostly not thought about it, because the marble had been a marble and the marble had bought bread and bread was non-negotiable. But he was thinking about it now, the way it had thrown its small rainbows on the cave wall in the mornings, painting the gray stone with something it had not earned and did not deserve but received anyway freely every time the light came through. He was thinking about waking up to those colors, about the particular quality of a morning that contains unexpected light. He was thinking about the cave wall now, in the early hours before he came down to the market, bare and gray and not expecting anything. He was thinking about this, and about the horse, and about his mother's hands, and he was not entirely sure where one thought ended and another began when the child's voice cut through the market noise with the pure carrying quality that children's voices have in public spaces. "Mama, why is the dragon crying?" High and clear and entirely without malice, the way that children ask the true questions, not the questions that circle the difficult thing and approach it carefully from the side. But the direct question, the honest question, the question that simply names what it sees without any of the careful avoidance that adults spend so much effort maintaining. The market did not go quiet exactly, but it changed. A texture shifted in the background noise. He felt, without looking up, the alteration in attention. The adults who had been so carefully not looking at him suddenly confronted with the fact of him in a way that the child's question had made harder to sustain. He did not look up. He looked at the wooden horse on the cloth in front of him, at the chipped ear, at the mane his thumb knew by now the way it knew the smooth interior of his own scales. He breathed, which was what was available. He had not known he was crying. Now that he knew, he couldn't stop being aware of it, which didn't help. The coins from the horse would buy the wood. The wood would burn through the winter, and then winter would end and spring would have to come, spring being reliably non-negotiable, and in spring his fire would be stronger and he would be bigger and the hunting would improve and the path forward, while still more hope than certainty, would have more solid ground under it. This was the shape of it. This was the calculation that held. He kept his hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the horse, and he breathed the cold market air that smelled like wood smoke and animals and bread. And he waited for Fossick to finish his other negotiation and come over. Because Fossick always came over and commerce would proceed and the horse would go and the coins would come and the wood would be purchased and the cave would be a degree less cold, and this was enough. This had to be enough. The small cloth bird was still at home. He had not brought it. He would not bring it, not yet, not this season, not while the cave still smelled faintly in the deepest corner where the cold didn't quite reach, like smoke and warm stone and the specific presence of something enormous and careful and entirely gone. Some things you hold on to. Even when you are 3 seasons old and barely bigger than a dog, and your fire comes in puffs, and you are alone on a mountain in winter, and the world is a calculation you are still learning how to run. Even then, especially then, the girl who stopped walking. Her name was Marin, and she had not intended to stop. This was important to her afterward in the way that the unintended things often turn out to be the most important, the decisions that don't announce themselves as decisions, that arrive wearing the ordinary clothes of a moment you're simply passing through. She had been passing through. That was the truth of it. She was on the East Road with a basket of early winter vegetables cutting into the crook of her arm, and a mind occupied entirely by the small domestic commerce of her own life. The supper she would make from what she was carrying, the leak in her cottage roof that had migrated slightly to the left since last week's rain and would need attending before the serious cold arrived. The question of lamp oil and whether the merchant on the south end of the market had finally brought his price back to something a person could reasonably pay. These were the things in her head, not, what might I find today that will change the particular shape of my life? Not, at what point does a person's path intersect with something they cannot simply walk past? Just supper and the roof and lamp oil and the half-mile remaining between her and her own front door. She saw the small green shape from 30 paces and made the reasonable assumption, because it was a reasonable assumption, that it was a child in a costume of some unusual ambition. Someone's child in the marketplace, the way children always were, underfoot and inexplicable. She adjusted her basket and walked toward the well and got close enough that the details resolved and the reasonable assumption became untenable. It was a dragon. A very small dragon, no taller than her hip, she assessed automatically, with the practical measuring instinct she had developed raising 2 brothers and never quite lost. With scales the color that moss goes in spring, that soft not quite green that is really an argument between green and gray, still deciding. Its wings were folded against its back with the tight, uncomfortable closeness of something held in because holding out was no longer safe. She had seen birds sit that way in bad weather, not the easy folding of rest but the tense folding of endurance. The distinction was legible to her in a moment, and the moment that followed it was the one where the sensible part of her brain assembled its reasonable observations and presented them for her consideration. Dragons were dangerous. The histories were full of burned villages and the reasons for nights, and even a small dragon was a dragon, and she did not know where its parents were, which was either the most important question or the one she least wanted answered. This was not her business. Her business was 30 paces east of here at a steady walking pace, supper and the bucket positioned under the leak and the lamp oil question tomorrow. She had no particular money to spare, and getting involved in something she didn't understand the edges of was, as a general principle of survival, inadvisable. She had raised 2 brothers, though, she knew the look. The dragon was sitting behind a square of cloth on which sat a single object, a stuffed bird made from cloth that had once been brightly colored and had faded into something softer, one wing slightly askew from the other, button eyes regarding the market square with the cheerful blankness of things that have been loved into simplicity. The dragon was looking at this bird with an expression that required no translation. Marin had seen it before. She had seen it on her younger brother's face when he was 11 and their mother had been sick, and he had carried responsibilities that belonged to someone twice his age. And she had seen it on the faces of people in hard winters in markets not unlike this one. The specific expression of someone about to do a necessary thing that will cost more than whatever they get for it. Someone about to sell the last thing they had left. The sensible part of her brain was still making its reasonable points. She noted this and walked over anyway, because the sensible part of her brain, while useful in a general way, had occasionally steered her past things she later spent years thinking about. He looked up when she arrived in front of his cloth, and she saw his eyes amber, the color of old honey with light behind it, rimmed with the redness of someone who had been crying and was now done with that, or was trying to be done with that, and she saw him brace. She recognized the bracing too, the preparation for a particular kind of interaction, the particular preemptive fortification against whatever form the fear or the cruelty would take this time. She had 1 second, she understood, to establish what kind of interaction this was going to be. "How much for the bird?" she asked. His chin came up small and certain. "It's not for sale." "Good," Marin said, and sat down on the edge of the well as if she had been planning to sit there all along, as if this was a perfectly ordinary place for her to be on her way home on a cold afternoon. "Tell me its name." He stared at her. She could see him recalculating, sorting through the available categories for what she was, and finding that she didn't fit the ones he'd prepared for. Fear would have been known by now. He had developed a working relationship with fear, she could tell, the kind of familiarity that at least has the virtue of predictability. Whatever this was, it wasn't fitting the pattern, and she watched him decide what to do with that. "Why?" he said finally. "Because it looks like it has one." The wind moved through the market square, pulling at the edge of his cloth and making the stalls around them shift and murmur. Nearby, someone dropped a bucket, a sudden clatter and clang on the flagstones, and Ember flinched hard, a full-body reflex that he clearly hadn't intended and clearly wished hadn't happened, the involuntary honesty of a nervous system that had been on alert for long enough that it had stopped asking permission. He looked at her after, with the specific embarrassment of someone who would rather have seemed less transparent. She looked back at him with an expression that said, "I saw that, and it tells me something, and I am not going to use it against you." "Pips," he said finally, quietly. "My mother called her Pip." She held the name carefully, the way she would hold anything fragile handed to her without ceremony. His mother called her. Past tense, and the deliberateness with which he had not elaborated on that past tense, the way he had set it down and left it exactly where it was, not inviting further pressure, told her what she needed to know about the shape of the situation. Not everything, enough. "I'm Marin," she said. "What do they call you?" "Zember." She looked at him for a moment. The name, the warmth suggested by it, the small creature in front of her who was managing a cold that went beyond weather, and she looked at the empty cloth where a hoard had once been laid out with care, and the neat stack of coins beside it, counted and recounted probably, and the thin line of his shoulders under his spring-green scales. She did the arithmetic quietly, without ceremony, because making a show of it would have been a cruelty of a different kind. Some people, when they recognize another person's difficulty, need the recognizing to be visible, need the other person to know that they've been seen in their struggle. Marin had been seen in her own struggles often enough to know that sometimes that visibility is the last thing you want, that sometimes what you need is simply someone who has done the arithmetic and is responding to the result without making you stand there while they perform the doing of it. "Have you eaten today, Ember?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, actually full of the careful management of a creature who had been practicing not seeming desperate, and was now in the presence of someone who was not going to be deceived by the practicing, but was also not going to make a spectacle of not being deceived. His silence was his answer, and they both knew it, and neither of them drew attention to the knowing. She reached into her basket. The parsnip was a good one. She'd have saved it for a soup that would have lasted 2 days, and the cured ham she unwrapped from its cloth was the good kind, the dense, close-grained kind that the butcher on the north end cured himself, which she had been looking forward to, actually, as a specific comfort against the cold walk home. She set them on the ground in the space between them, not pushed toward him, not presented with the theatrical generosity that would have required gratitude, just placed. Available. He looked at the food, and then at her with an expression she recognized from animals that had been treated unkindly. The specific wariness of a creature that has learned, through repeated experience, that kindness from an unexpected source usually indicates something else underneath it, that gifts have prices, that the cost is revealed later when you're already obligated by the having of it. She understood why he looked at her that way. She did not take it personally. "No trick," she said. "You're hungry, I have food, that's all this is." He ate slowly. This was the thing that undid her, a little, not the eating but the manner of it. He ate with a deliberate carefulness that did not come naturally to hungry young creatures, that had been learned and practiced, that said, I have taught myself not to seem like what I am, which is desperate, because seeming desperate makes you a different kind of visible, and I have had enough of all the kinds of visible. She watched him eat with the dignity he had assembled for himself, piece by careful piece, and she felt something in the vicinity of her chest do something she didn't have exact words for, though the closest was probably, "Oh, this one has been working very hard." The market moved around them and she let it move, not filling the space with words because the space didn't need filling. She had learned with her brothers that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person is the quality of your company, the signal that you are here and not going anywhere and not requiring anything of them, that your presence is not conditional on their being a particular way. She sat on the well with her basket on her knees and she was there, and gradually, slowly enough that she nearly missed it happening, which meant it was genuine rather than performed, the rigid braced quality went out of his small body. His shoulders dropped a quarter-inch. The grip on Pip loosened from the two-handed grip of armor and became the one-armed loose carry of habit. She asked him easy questions. She was good at easy questions, questions that had short answers, that opened doors without demanding entry, that let a person offer what they wanted to offer without being required to offer more. What was the mountain like in winter? Whether he preferred the stalls on the east side of the market or the west side. Whether he found the noise of it exhausting, because she sometimes did. He answered in short sentences, and the sentences became longer as the afternoon went on, acquiring a clause here and a detail there that he had not originally planned to include, but that arrived anyway. The small expansions of a creature becoming cautiously willing to take up slightly more space than it had been given. She did not ask about his parents. She did not ask how long he had been alone or what he had heard that night or what the 3 weeks after had been like. She did not ask any of the questions that were actually the important questions, because the important questions were not for right now, and she trusted that he knew she had them, and that her not asking them was a choice she was making, not an oversight. The light changed the way light changes in the late afternoon of winter days, going golden suddenly, the angle of it stretching the shadows long and warm in a way that is beautiful, and also means it is later than you thought. Marin registered this and registered what it meant, and she stood and brushed off her skirt with the efficiency of someone who has things to do but is not in a hurry about them, and she picked up her basket. She had thought about what to say on the walk over. Not planned, she hadn't planned any of this, but in the few minutes of sitting she had assembled the words with some care because the words mattered and she knew they mattered and she wanted to get them right. Not too much. Nothing that would press him, nothing that would make the invitation feel like pressure, nothing that closed the door he would need to be able to close if he needed to close it. "My cottage is a half-mile down the east road," she said. She heard her own voice, even matter-of-fact, a woman describing a thing that exists rather than making an offer that could be weighed and found wanting. "It has a fireplace and a floor and a roof with only one leak, which I have a bucket for. I make reasonable soup." She paused, the exact length of pause needed. "You're welcome to come if you want, you don't have to." The last part was important. She meant it entirely and needed him to hear that she meant it not as a social nicety, the kind of no obligation that actually comes preloaded with obligation, but as a true statement of the available options. He could come, he could not come. Both were genuinely acceptable to her, though she would think about him on the walk home and put a little extra in the soup regardless, for a reason she didn't examine. He looked at her. She had been looked at by many people in her life and in many ways, but there was something particular about the way Ember looked at her that she thought she would carry with her for a long time. It was an old look for a young face, the look of a creature that has been doing hard assessments for long enough that the assessment has become a reflex, that has learned to read the distance between what people say and what they mean, that knows the look of kindness with a cost and the look of obligation dressed as generosity, and was looking at her now and doing the calculation and arriving at something. She waited and did not rush him. He reached out and straightened the coins in their stack. She didn't know if he knew he was doing it, a tidying gesture, the last act of a creature putting away one arrangement of the world before accepting another. He picked up his coins and wrapped his fingers around them and tucked Pip under his arm with the ease of long practice, the way you hold something you have held so many times that your arm knows the shape of it without being asked. He stood up. He was not tall. He barely came to her hip, and he was thin under his spring-green scales, and his wings were still a little too small for him, and his eyes were still rimmed with the red of old crying, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes, and she thought, here is a creature who has been doing a very difficult thing alone for longer than something his size should have to do it. She didn't say this. She simply turned toward the east road and began to walk, at a pace that a creature with shorter legs could match without difficulty. After a moment, she heard small clawed feet on the flagstones behind her. And then beside her. The east road was quiet in the late golden light, the trees on either side holding the last warmth of the afternoon in their bare branches, and Marin walked and Ember walked and Pip rode in the crook of his arm with her button eyes forward. And the cottage was half a mile away with its fireplace and its one managed leak, and the soup that Marin was already composing in her mind, parsnip, the ham, the other roots in the basket, something warming and dense, the kind that fills a cold space from the inside out. She did not ask how long he planned to stay. She did not make any calculation about the future, about what this was or what it would become, about the practicalities she would have to sort through in the days ahead. She just walked and let him walk beside her, and let the distance between the market and her door close in the ordinary way that distance closes. One step and then the next, each one bringing them closer to the place she was going, which was warm. What a home feels like. The leak in the roof was, in Ember's professional opinion, more ambitious than one bucket could reasonably handle. He had arrived at this opinion gradually, over 3 days of observation. In the way that he was finding he arrived at most of his opinions now, through careful watching, through the accumulation of detail, through the particular discipline of a creature who has learned that paying attention is one of the few resources that doesn't run out. He had watched the first bucket sit in its position with modest competence through the first night and the second, catching what came through the gap above the east corner with a steady plink 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 that became, over time, a kind of background note in the cottage's indoor weather. He had noted the ceiling around it, the way the water moved through the roofing material, the small dark stain radiating outward from the source in the way that water always finds its territory and expands it quietly when no one is watching. He had been waiting with the patience that hunger had taught him for the second one. It appeared on the third morning as he had expected it would 2 feet from the first, slightly less ambitious in its initial flow, but with the long-term attitude of something that intended to develop its position. Marin came in from the garden with mud on her boots and cold on her coat, and stopped in the middle of the main room and looked at the new dark spot on the ceiling, and then looked at the floor below it, and then went to the corner where she kept the spare bucket and put the spare bucket under the new leak with the specific quality of resignation that belongs to people who live alone and are accustomed to managing the slow betrayals of old structures by themselves. "I can fix it," Ember said. She turned and looked at him. He had learned her expressions with the thoroughness of someone for whom reading faces had become a survival skill, and he catalogued this one. The politely skeptical expression, which was related to but distinct from the genuinely skeptical expression, and distinct also from the expression she wore when she disagreed but was choosing not to argue, and from the expression she wore when she was concealing amusement. The politely skeptical expression said, "I am taking this statement seriously enough to consider it, and I have considered it, and here is my consideration." "You're 3, she said. "I'm 3 in dragon years." He had been thinking about how to make this argument and was ready for it, which is closer to 8 in human years, and I have very good climbing claws. He paused and added because it was relevant and because he had been noticing this about himself lately, and my fire is getting stronger. I can seal the gaps in the shingles. Heat makes the wood swell and close against itself if you do it right. She looked at him for a moment longer with the politely skeptical expression. Then she looked at the 2 buckets. Then she handed him the situation not with words, but with the particular movement of a person who has decided to extend trust beyond what the evidence strictly requires, which Ember had come to understand was one of the ways she operated, one of the things about her that was not quite explicable in terms of ordinary practicality. He spent the afternoon on the roof. He had not been entirely honest about his fire control, or rather he had been honest about its current state without fully accounting for the gap between its current state and what the task would require. It was improving. This was true, genuinely true. He could feel it improving the way you feel a muscle becoming more reliable through use. But improving toward adequate and adequate were not quite the same thing, and the shingles were smaller and closer together than he had accounted for, and the cold wind at roof height did something unhelpful to his concentration. The 2 scorch marks on the northeast corner were, he decided, firmly decorative. They were not large, they were not structural. They added character. He had heard Marin use the word character approvingly about the cottage's uneven floorboards and its slightly titled doorframe, so character seemed like a reasonable category. The important thing, the thing he came down from the roof carrying carefully, like the coins he had counted and recounted, like the arrangement of objects on the cloth square that had needed to be right even when nothing else was that the leak stopped. Both of them. He stood inside and looked at the ceiling in the spot where the first bucket had been and the spot where the second bucket had been, and watched them not drip for long enough to be certain of it. When Marin came in from whatever she had been doing in the garden, staying out of his way, he understood, giving him the space to do the thing without being watched while he did it, which was a specific courtesy she extended regularly and which he had not known how to name for the first week and could now name precisely. She treated his dignity as something worth protecting. She went to the ceiling and she looked at it. She didn't perform the moment. She didn't exclaim or make the broad gestures of surprise and approval that he had watched adults perform for children he'd observed in the market, the theatrical celebration that was really about the adult's feeling rather than the child's accomplishment. She looked at the dry ceiling with the thorough attention she gave to anything she was checking, nodded once, the particular nod that meant this has been done correctly, and went back to the pot she was stirring. But her eyes, when they passed over him, were warm. Ember took the moment and put it somewhere. He had a place for things like this now, not a hoard in any formal sense, nothing that could be laid out on a cloth square, but something that operated on similar principles. A collection, a keeping. The nod and the warmth in her eyes and the second bucket of soup she had set in front of him on the first night without asking whether he wanted more, and the way she had come downstairs on the second night. He would not have admitted the nightmares. This was a matter of some internal conviction for him, that certain things were private, that certain vulnerabilities were not for the outside world, that the careful dignity he had assembled for himself at the market had not been only for the market but was also part of who he was trying to be. He was 3 seasons old and he had been alone on a mountain, and he had come down and sold the pieces of his hoard one by one, and he had done these things with a specific quality of self-possession. And self-possession felt important to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate but knew was real. The nightmares did not care about self-possession. They came in the deep part of the nights, not always, not with regularity, but with enough frequency that he had begun to dread the hour when the fire burned down and the cottage went quiet and the dark pressed in. They were not narrative exactly. They did not tell him a story he could push back against with logic or argument. They were more like a quality, a temperature, a specific silence. The weight of 3 weeks of waiting compressed into the few hours of sleep and deposited behind his ribs where they sat heavy and cold until morning. On the second night he had woken with the cold weight of them still present and found Marin sitting near his corner with her own blanket around her shoulders. She had not said anything. She had not performed comfort, had not offered the words that circle around the difficult thing and try to soften it by surrounding it. She had simply been there, a warm and solid presence in the dark, and the weight behind his ribs had not disappeared but had become somehow more bearable in the specific way that things become more bearable when you are not alone with them. She did this when she heard him after that. He knew she could hear him, the cottage had thin walls and Marin was a light sleeper, both things he had assessed early. He knew she came down intentionally, not from accident or some other errand. She never mentioned it in the daytime. He never mentioned it either, and the unmentioning of it was a mutual agreement they had arrived at without discussion, and he found that he was more grateful for her silence about it in daylight than he was for almost anything else. The cottage organized itself around him in the way that spaces do when a new presence is genuinely incorporated, rather than merely accommodated. There was a distinction, he had come to understand, between a space that has been adjusted to tolerate you and a space that has been adjusted to include you, and the difference was legible in small things. Whether the adjustments were purely functional or whether they carried any quality of care, whether they remained temporary seeming or acquired the ease of something settled. Marin had made him a sleeping corner near the fireplace. A folded blanket that was thick and had been aired out, he could smell the outside cold in it, which meant she had hung it on the garden line at some point, a small labor she had not mentioned, and a flat stone she had told him, practically, that his body warmth would heat and would hold the heat through the night. She had been right about the stone. He had not told her how much the rightness of it had meant, that she had thought about the specifics of how a small dragon might stay warm, that she had thought about it enough to solve it. Pip had a shelf. This was perhaps the smallest of the accommodations and the one that had landed most precisely. He had come in on the second morning to find that a small wooden shelf, emptied of the few objects that had been on it, those objects relocated to another spot he hadn't yet found, had been cleared and positioned at a height his wing reach could manage easily, not on the floor and not out of reach. Pip sat on it now and regarded the main room with her button eyes and her lopsided wings and her cheerful equanimity. And the shelf was hers in the same way that the corner was his, in the way that things become yours in a home that is genuinely incorporating rather than merely tolerating. He helped where he was able and found ability where he had not expected it. His fire was the most obvious contribution. Lighting the hearth in the mornings was faster and less effortful than flint, once his control had improved enough to be reliable. And the lamps in the evenings, and the warming of the flat stone on the nights when Marin had the specific tiredness that cold days produced, and the alternative of letting it heat by the fire would take too long. He climbed, his claws were good, genuinely good, and the high places that required a ladder and effort from Marin were simple for him. A quick scaling of whatever surface and the retrieval of the thing. The assessment of the frost damage in the upper garden that could be done from the fence post rather than requiring her to get her boots wet going in among the beds. The smoke that came when he was startled was the thing he was most conscious of managing, The involuntary output that embarrassed him the way the flinching at the market had embarrassed him. The involuntary honesty of a nervous system that had been on alert for long enough that it had stopped requesting permission before responding. He was working on it. The working on it was the slow, unglamorous work of retraining something that had been necessary and was now excessive, convincing his body through patient repetition that the loud sounds in this space were not preceded by the sounds he had heard from behind the boulder. Marin handled it by not startling him on purpose. This was not a small thing. She moved through the cottage with a consideration that was not loud about itself. She did not announce her movements or overwarn him, which would have been its own kind of visibility, but she moved with a kind of awareness and attention to where he was and what he was doing before she did things that might register as sudden. When it happened anyway, when the unexpected clatter of something dropped or the door caught by wind produced the small cloud of smoke that he had not chosen to produce, she said nothing. Not, "It's fine," not, "Don't worry about it." Simply nothing, the way that nothing is sometimes the most honest response to something that needs no comment. She taught him to read. He had mentioned it carefully, a hedge of qualification around the wanting in case the wanting was inconvenient. He'd always been curious. His mother had read to him sometimes. He understood if it was too much trouble, and she had gone to the small shelf of books that occupied the section of wall between the window and the door and had selected one and had sat down at the table and said, "Come here then." Not as if it were a gift she was giving, not with the quality of doing him a particular favor, but in the way that you respond to a reasonable request that you intend to fulfill. She was a patient teacher. She had the specific patience of someone who had been taught herself at some point by someone who had not been patient, and had learned from that experience what patience in a teacher actually costs and what it produces. She did not hurry him through the letters or the sounds or the slow and lurching early words. When he made mistakes, and he made them with the frequency of any beginning reader, the letters rearranging themselves, the sounds combining in ways that logic suggested but language did not support, she simply corrected and moved forward without weight, without the subtle inflation of the mistake that would have made each subsequent one carry more dread. By the deep of winter he was reading from the books himself, slowly and with effort but genuinely, the words resolving into sense with a satisfaction he had not been prepared for, the specific satisfaction of a new competence, of a thing being added to the account of what you could do. The garden she walked him through with the proprietorial knowledge of someone who had been tending the same ground for years and had the specific relationship with it that long tending produces. Knowing which corner drained poorly and which held warmth, which plants were merely dormant and which had not survived the first hard freeze, what would come back in spring and what would need replanting. He listened with the attention he had brought to everything here, the attention that had started as a survival calculation and had gradually become something less calculating and more like genuine interest, curiosity without agenda, learning for its own value rather than for what it would purchase. He taught her the two dragon songs. He had not planned to. He had not thought about the songs in weeks, had kept them in the same interior location where he kept the amber of his mother's eyes and the resonance of her voice, not to be taken out and handled, because handling things in that location cost more than he could afford in the ordinary run of days. But they had been sitting by the fire one evening, and the silence had gone warm and comfortable the way it did in those evenings, had lost its quality of emptiness and become instead the silence of a space that is simply peaceful, and one of the songs had arrived in his throat without announcement, and he had let it come. It was a small song, not the great dragon choruses of the histories, the legendary singing that was said to shake mountains. He was 3 seasons old and barely bigger than a dog, and his fire came in modest puffs, and his singing was calibrated accordingly. It was a simple melody, the kind his mother had used in the evenings when the horde was settled and the night was quiet, a low and circular tune that went around itself a few times and then resolved into a silence that felt earned rather than empty. Marin had set her darning down. She listened without interrupting and without the performed attention that signals someone waiting for you to finish, the real listening, the kind that changes the quality of what is being listened to because the listener is genuinely present in it. When he finished, she did not applaud or compliment. She just sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Again." He sang it again, and then the other one, the shorter one, the one his father had hummed when he moved around the cave in the mornings, which was not really a song but a series of tones that meant something Ember could not translate into words but could reproduce. He did not tell her what it was from. She did not ask. This was one of her particular skills he had come to understand, the ability to receive what was offered and not press for what was not, to take the part of the story he was ready to tell and not reach for the part he wasn't. He did not know if this was something she had cultivated deliberately or simply a quality of her nature, and he was not sure the distinction mattered. The result was the same. In this cottage on this east road, he got to determine what he said and when he said it, and that control, small and ordinary seeming, the kind that most people took as a baseline, was not small to him. One evening in the deep of the winter, snow banked against the door and the window and against the world in general. The fire burning with the steady confidence of a fire that has been properly fed and maintained. Marin reading by the lamp and ember with his book open on the floor in front of him. He had developed the habit of reading on the floor because the angle felt right, because lying with the book between his front legs left his hands free and let him turn pages with a claw tip. Because the floor near the fire was warm, he looked up from his page and found himself saying something he had not been planning to say. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he said, "when I'm grown, where I'm supposed to go." Marin turned a page. "You don't have to know that yet," she said. He looked at the fire. Dragons are supposed to have hordes, territories, a mountain. He thought about the cave. He thought about the marble throwing its colors on the gray stone and about the wooden horse on his mother's shelf and about the smell of smoke and warm stone that the cave didn't have anymore. "I have a stuffed bird and 43 copper coins." 47, she said without looking up from her book. "I paid you for the roof." "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked at him over the top of the page, and this was the expression he had learned was the completely meaning expression, the one that didn't hedge or soften or leave room for reinterpretation. "Ember, you have time. That's actually what you have most of, time and the growing that comes with it. The mountain isn't going anywhere. Your horde will come." A pause, small and deliberate. "And for right now you have a corner and a shelf and someone who is glad you're here. That's not nothing." He looked at the fire for a long time. The fire was a good fire. It was burning the wood he had carried in from the pile outside. He had started doing this without being asked, the morning maintenance of it, because it was a thing that needed doing and he could do it, and the doing of it was a contribution he could make to the space that was keeping him. He had added to the fire this evening, and it had caught well and was burning with the steady, reliable warmth of something properly maintained. He thought about what she had said, about the corner and the shelf and the being glad. He thought about how those things were not the mountain or the horde or the territories of the dragon stories, not the great accumulated treasures of centuries, not the deep emerald scales and the enormous wingspan and the fire that could heat stone reliably from 20 feet. They were small things. A blanket, a stone, a wooden shelf with a stuffed bird on it. An East Road cottage with 2 scorch marks on the northeast shingles, and a bookshelf between the window and the door and soup that was, as advertised, reasonable. He thought about reasonable soup. About how it had tasted, that first bowl, and how it had tasted different from the bread and dried meat he had rationed out on the mountain, not better in terms of its specific qualities. The soup being simply what it was, but different in the way that anything tastes different when you eat it somewhere that expects you to be there. "Someone who is glad you're here." He turned the phrase over carefully, examining it. "No," he said finally, and his voice came out smaller than he had intended, quieter, with some quality in it that he recognized but could not have named precisely. The sound of a creature setting down something it has been carrying for longer than it knew. "It's not nothing." Outside, the snow fell in the way that snow falls when it intends to continue steadily, without drama, remaking the world white. The fire burned. Pip sat on her shelf with her button eyes and her lopsided wings, regarding the room with her cheerful equanimity, one wing slightly higher than the other, exactly as she always was. Marin turned a page. Ember put his head down on his folded arms and looked at the fire, and the fire gave him its steady warmth, and the cottage held the winter outside where winter belonged, and somewhere between one breath and the next he was asleep. He did not dream. Not of the cave, not of the silence, not of the 3 weeks or the cold weight that had been sitting behind his ribs since the night he had woken to the absence of everything. He did not dream of the market square, or the careful not seeing of the adults, or the child's voice carrying over the noise of commerce to name the thing he had not known he was doing. He did not dream of the wooden horse, or the marble, or the river stones his mother had chosen one by one from a stream 2 valleys over for reasons he would never now know. He slept the sleep of something that has found, at the end of a long and difficult journey, a place that is simply, adequately, entirely warm. And the snow fell and the fire burned and the roof held.